Good evening, everyone. Welcome in our talk in Taz-Kantine, our conversation with Timothy Snyder, and at the same time, the last public event in the framework of the project At the End of Time, Ukraine of the last 10 years in European history. My name is Katerina Mishchenko. I am a program manager of the Federal Agency for Civic Education, or die Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung. And I will moderate this evening today. I am always starting the talks with some acknowledgements and with my thankfulness to all of the team members who made this event possible. It's my dear colleagues Constanze, Hanna, Christina, Gordy is somewhere, Heike is also here. And of course, I also want to thank to Taz-Kantine for the possibility to have Timothy Snyder and to have you all today, and for organizing a live stream for all of those who are watching online. We are speaking with Timothy Snyder today. One of the reasons we are doing this is his new book on freedom, which is also available today for you to buy and for you to get a signature from the author. Yeah. We will see how it is organized. I don't know where where the book table is, somewhere. There. Yeah. And yeah, Timothy is ready to sign. I don't know to which extent. So let's be quick. Yeah. It's always interesting how to introduce people who are gathering such big audiences. Actually, you all know who he is, but of course, I would like to introduce you. Yeah, Timothy Snyder is a professor of history at Yale University, and since recently also in Toronto, in Canada. He is a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, where we met, actually, like 11 years ago. He is scholar of history of Central and Eastern Europe, of Soviet Union, of Holocaust, and he speaks a lot of languages, 5, and he reads in 10 European languages. His books were translated in even more languages, and he's got a lot of prizes. He was working with artists, films, operas were made based on his work. Also, political movements or demonstrations were inspired by his ideas. And he's also one of his book on tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, we just made a selfie with, was published as a very beautiful graphic novel in cooperation with a German-American artist, Nora Krug. And his books, you probably know, are dedicated to Habsburg, Red Prince Vasil Vyshyvany, to history of Holocaust, and his book Black Earth, the Holocaust as History and Warning. I think in Germany you became really popular and important historian after the publication of Bloodlands, Europe between Hitler and Stalin. You are also author of the book The Road to Unfreedom, about Russia, America, and Europe. You became very super popular in the US, I think, after the publication of your book on tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. And now, or today, we will refer to your new book. I have in English, or the American copy of it, on freedom, which is kind of continuation of the tyranny, but as you see, is much bigger, and because it's future-oriented, as far as I understood your intention. But what else is Timothy Snyder? He is, as Ukrainians would say, a big friend of Ukraine. And this friendship is based not only, or is articulated or performed not only in his interviews and many events organized in Ukraine or dedicated to Ukraine. Timothy Snyder is also initiator of Ukrainian, how is it called? Ukraine Global History Initiative, which gathered about 90 scholars who are working on so-called deep Ukrainian history, meaning looking back in in really ancient times, and yeah, the intention is to globalize Ukrainian history and to understand it much better, which is a wonderful historical and research approach, but also politically it's incredibly important. And since you are a friend of Ukraine, I wanted to start our talk with Ukraine, actually, and with something what you are mentioning in your book on freedom. It's interesting. You are starting with Ukraine, and you are, like in your conclusions, you are again in Ukraine. I think both of these parts were at least partly written during your trips to Ukraine now, during the full-scale invasion. But my question refers to something what was like in the middle, not in the within this beginning and end frame. I want to ask you about Maidan and the lessons of Maidan, which are useful today. Look, let's, I don't know, switch on our political imagination. We are today in a completely different situation than 11 years ago. But what is still relevant, what does still have potential for today's politics in Europe, or maybe on a more global level, if we look back to Maidan? I don't know, maybe it doesn't make sense historically, or does it?
Oh, I think it does. First of all, thanks to everyone for being here. Thanks to the Taz Kabina. I didn't realize there was a Taz Kabina. I'm sure it's where, sorry, Cantina. I'm sure the Cantina is where all the cool people hang out. And if I had known about that, I see some nodding. If I'd known, I would have come earlier. But I'm not a cool person. I'm just a person who's occasionally interviewed by Taz, and I appreciate their support and the interest over the years, and I appreciate the good work that Taz does for this city and this country. Ukraine, so let me begin with an acknowledgement there of my own. These have been difficult days in my own country, and I look around and ask myself, who is doing something right now to preserve the existence of the American Republic, or to preserve the existence of the rule of law, or to preserve the existence of democracy? And it's odd, but at least in my world, the answer that I can safely give every day is the Ukrainian armed forces. And because in my view, although we take them for granted, it's because the Ukrainians are fighting that we can sit here in Berlin and have nice conversations like this. They've bought all of us an awful lot of time, and we waste that time, and we do the wrong things, and we don't thank them. But I want to begin with that acknowledgement, because I think there is a very direct connection between what happens in Ukraine and what happens to the rest of us. And I do think that what happened a bit more than 10 years ago in Kiev on Maidan is very important. Let me make three connections. The first connection would be that sometimes politics is metaphysical. So sometimes politics is a matter of right and wrong. And that's the first lesson in the On Tyranny book, which we were just looking at On Tyranny during the Technische Pause because the jacket was actually designed by someone who's missing in action in this war, and it's a beautiful jacket. But that's the first lesson of On Tyranny: do not obey in advance, which is it's a German phrase, vor as eilende Gehorsam. But it's a very East European lesson as well, if you think about it positively, that sometimes there are moments when your own sense of the normal has to count, as opposed to what everybody is doing around you. And that's what I mean when I say sometimes politics is metaphysical. Like, there will just be moments when you have to do something because you have to do something. And Maidan was like that. I mean, one can analyze it and one can talk about motives and actors and structures and the European Union and all kinds of different things. But there's an irreducible sense in which it was metaphysical. People had a sense that this just shouldn't happen. Our country just shouldn't be like this. And the second thing, which is, I think, very relevant to the present, very relevant in the United States and perhaps soon relevant in Germany, is the sense that politics is very much of the moment, that sometimes you have to do something not later, but now, because the later doesn't ever arrive. So if Maidan hadn't taken place when it did, beginning in late 2013, then Ukraine wouldn't be, in my judgment, wouldn't be a sovereign state now, or this war would have been much worse than it actually is, or Ukraine would have lost the war a long time ago. Things would be very different. And as we head into what is going to be a very challenging year, 2025, that's something to keep in mind. I'm thinking, of course, of the United States, where things are moving very quickly right now. But it's going to be true in general, that there'll be moments where you think, should I protest now or should I wait? And probably the answer is that you should protest now. And the third thing which comes to me, Katya, when I think about this, is actually how it really is all of one moment. As we were talking about before, Katya and I got into a really nice conversation, which is why we were almost late. Like, we almost did the thing where we had the conversation between ourselves and forgot that there was an audience, which is ideal in every respect except one, which is that the audience is sitting here waiting. But there is a real sense, I think, in which the historical moment we're in now, at least for a certain part of the world. I understand that there are different historical Cäsuri in different parts of the world, but for this part of the world, I think late 2013, early 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time under this cloud of disinformation, that was a shift. The idea that you can do things in the real world, like invade a country, and that be less important than the conversation about the propaganda, that was new. I mean, there's always been propaganda and there's always been information wars, but that was a kind of turning point. Like that moment when Russia invaded Ukraine and everybody in the West debated whether Ukraine deserved it because they were all gay, or whether they deserved it because they were all Jews, or whether they deserved it because they were all Nazis. Like that moment when the whole conversation in the West, and I'm exaggerating, but just a tiny bit, when the whole conversation in the West was about why Ukraine deserved it, and then the reasons why Ukraine deserved it were all Russian propaganda memes, which had been spread over social media to vulnerable people based upon their publicly available vulnerabilities. Like, I think that was the beginning of a moment that we're all living in now. And this is like one way of thinking about it is that if you're in Germany or the US, it's really helpful to know what happened in Russia and Ukraine from especially like 1991 to 2014, because pretty much everything that happened there happens to us later. Like, we'd like to think that we're ahead of them in some way, but that's not true. It's the other way around. Like, the bad things that the Ukrainians have largely gotten over are now repeating themselves in the West. And the bad things that have gotten worse in Russia are now repeating themselves in the West. So I think it really helps to know both the syndromes, but also the forms of resistance.
I remember in one of your, I'm still in Ukraine with my thoughts and my question. In one of your blog texts, which you wrote after Trump election, you wrote that, and for me it was really inspiring and important to read. Now it's important to support those who are fighting, who are opposing all these right-wing trends. And Ukraine was, which is fighting and resisting Russian aggression, was an example for you of kind of political position which should be taken today. Not to be scared, not to be paralyzed by the trends, by the events, but at least to support those who are fighting, if you are not fighting yourself. In this regard, I want to ask you, you wrote this book about freedom. How can you connect your concept of freedom or all these different forms of freedom you are describing in the book with the Ukrainian, I don't know, spirit, situation, political, social situation today?
So I tend to think there's a wisdom in the last 10 years and in the last 3 years in Ukraine, which I think partly because of maybe our own Western prejudices we don't necessarily listen to. The Ukrainians have fought their way into our minds in a cognitive sense. Like everybody now pretty much accepts that there is such a place as Ukraine. Everyone thinks about Ukraine in that sense, except people with, terrible bad faith. But what I was trying to do with the book is to check myself. So writing a book about what freedom is actually a really hard thing. I don't necessarily recommend it as something to do. It's a lot easier to write a little book about how to defend something than it is to say what that something in fact is, which was the challenge that I was trying to meet. And I tried to meet it honestly, which is to say philosophically, before I got to the politics. But one of the things about freedom which is deceptively hard is that you can't really think about it by yourself. So it's very tempting as soon as the subject freedom comes up to sort of shift to the individual, and the conveniently available individual happens to be yourself. So it's very easy when talking or write about freedom to shift into the first person. And that's in most books about freedom, at least in English, make that move pretty quickly. And I want to suggest that if you do that, you can't possibly get freedom right, because freedom isn't just about an isolated individual. An isolated individual is powerless and unfree. And an individual who doesn't know herself or himself or themselves is also unfree. You can't, everyone, even the people who haven't thought about it a lot, would probably agree that to be free, you have to know yourself, so your own interests at the very least. Like even the simplest minded, neoliberals would say you have to know your own interests. They just wouldn't think about what it takes to know your own interests. And it takes quite a lot, because we're all, again, this is a talk that's going to be full of hard truths, but we're all pretty stupid about ourselves. In fact, we're not actually great authorities about ourselves. If you're in any doubt, have a heart-to-heart with your, girlfriend about this, or your mother, Mom, do I know myself well? And just see how that goes. Sorry, I have a cold. And I think one of the great illusions about freedom, and one of the ways we've gone wrong, is precisely this idea that freedom is me, and whatever I want. And that essentially, therefore, freedom is just about the barriers around me. so the barriers to my impulses, that's very deceptive, because if freedom is just about the barriers, then I don't ever have to ask who I am and what I value. I don't really ever have to become myself. And if freedom is just about what's outside of me, the government, whatever, then it's very easy to go through life just opposing things rather than being for things. And if I don't ask who I am and what I value, then it's very easy for me to fall into some kind of simple narrative about what that enemy is. For example, the libertarian narrative about how the government is always bad. It's a very simple narrative, like it solves all your problems for you. Something went wrong, oh, it's the government, let's cut taxes. Very simple, very appealing, but it never asks the question, who am I, or let alone who are the libertarians. Raise your hands. It allows you to push everything off, and that, this isn't just a moral problem. It's also a political problem, because if freedom is just about the barriers, then what do? We try to bring down those barriers, and sometimes that's very important and necessary and right. But if we say freedom is only about the barriers, then we end up saying, okay, the government is the problem, and we make the government very small, and then it's dysfunctional. And suddenly it's, January 2025 in the United States. Don't know if you've been following the news, but we're doing this little experiment where we fire everybody who works for the federal government, and then we see how many planes actually land on runways. It's going great. So you end up in this strange, perverse world where, like, the heroes of freedom are people like Elon Musk or Donald Trump, who, wreck things, destroy things, create a lot of unfreedom, and at the same time, strangely, are not actually happy and show no sign of knowing themselves or what they actually want. Freedom becomes like the rich and powerful people standing in the middle of the room and complaining the whole time. That's where we are right now, right? Where we are right now is the people who run the most powerful country in the world hog the stage and just whine about how hard life is. That's where we've ended up. And so that's just my way of saying that, for me, like, you can't be right about freedom by yourself. And that's a very simple point, but it's actually kind of a demanding point, because the easiest way to write about philosophical issues is to go from, like, argument to argument to argument and sort of hope that nobody notices, the gaps in the arguments. But, like, you assert things in, like, a strict order. And if you're Deutschsprachig, you, like, might even put numbers in front of each one, because, like, if I go 1, 2, 3, who could possibly contest that 3 came after 2, right? And if they're not going to contest that, then they're not going to contest the rest of it, and I'm just going to keep going on with my numbers. But you can't really talk about freedom that way, because freedom is like half in the metaphysical world and half in the physical world, and it's half me and it's half you, and so you can't really just argue it. You have to also show that you listen. And so I wrote the book in a particular way where there are a lot of encounters, but I was trying to raise that to a methodological level as well. I mean, that probably sounds a little pretentious, but I wanted to make sure I was listening to other people who talked about freedom. So I'm getting back to Ukraine, but it's why I taught the book in an American maximum security prison for a semester, because my students there talked about freedom too, but they had a different understanding and actually really good reasons for a different understanding of the term than I did, and so for similar reasons, actually, I took the book to Ukraine, because, like, both, Ukrainians and incarcerated Americans, like, they're close enough to me that I feel like I can understand, but far enough away that I'm going to get something out of the encounter. And so Ukrainians talk a lot about freedom, right? And I speak Ukrainian, and I wanted to hear what Ukrainians were saying. I wanted to listen to them. And I wanted to listen to people who knew who I was, like Zelensky, but I also wanted to listen to people who didn't have any idea who I was, like people in deoccupied territories, like people who just, like, people whose houses had been destroyed, people who were trying to return to their houses. And from the way they talked about freedom, I think the argument was really helped. One thing which was really important, and there are Ukrainians here, and they can correct me or amplify later, but one thing which is really important is that when Ukrainians talk about about freedom, they generally have the future in mind. And that seems like a very simple thing, but it's not. Like, I think it makes sense to always have the future in mind, because freedom is about caring about things you think are good and trying to put them in some kind of combination that you can realize in the world. And that means that you're imagining a future. If you think that freedom is about, like, me against the government, you're actually not thinking about the future. And that's a big trap that, like, the libertarians put you into, because if you think it's a constant struggle of me against the government, okay, that's a very dramatic story, but it's not a story with a future. It's just a constant horizontal. There's no fourth dimension to it. There's no time in that story, or the story of the free market, or any of these things. Like, there's no future in those stories. And for me, if there's not a future, there's actually no human freedom in the story. So one thing was the future. Another thing was character. And I have to say here, Zelensky was actually quite extraordinarily good. I had a number of people who talked to me in the same way. But again, if you think freedom is positive, so negative freedom is me against the world, and freedom consists in the opposition, and there's no real value in it, no values, no virtues, right? Kind of Werten. But where positive freedom means, like, I care about integrity, and I care about grace and beauty, and I care about mercy. I care about good things, and I'm trying to bring those things into the world in some kind of personal combination. I'm trying to leave some kind of trace in the world. And if you think about freedom negatively, and this is where things get interesting, if you think about freedom negatively, like if it's always impulses and it's always you against the world, then you can always follow those impulses, because you against the world can mean anything at any time. And so one thing that really struck me in a depressing way was in February 2022, when all the Americans assumed that Zelensky would run. And they all did. They all did. I mean, I went on television a few days before and said he probably wouldn't. And like the laughing at me was like consensual and bipartisan and multimedia. But one of the reasons why people assumed he would run, in my view, is that our view of freedom was basically negative. Like, it's just, it's me against the world, me against the government. And if it's me against something and it seems hopeless, well, of course I run. What else would I do? But if freedom is positive, if it's about a collection of values, then that means that as we live over time, we become a kind of, become a kind of beautiful accumulation of those values. That's the thing that we call character. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my native language there. Charakter. It's a thing we call character. And ironically, if you are a free person, you become a person of character, and then you arrive at moments where you feel like, actually, there's only one thing I can do here. I can't actually run here. If I'm going to be myself, then there's only one thing I can do. And that's what Zelensky's told me, and he told it, and without prompting, right? Like, I didn't prod him in any way. He told me a long story. When I asked him why he stayed, he didn't say, like, I stayed because I'm a great hero of the Ukrainian people. He didn't say that. He said, he started talking about, like, how he was raised by his parents, and he talked about other choices he'd made, and he talked about how it wasn't really him who stayed, it was all the Ukrainians who stayed, and they expected him to stay. He told a very interesting story about value choices and about, like, what it means to represent. He used that word represent a lot. And so freedom as moral character was something else that was helped. And then the third thing is positive freedom as politics. So like positive freedom as three-dimensional politics, as the way you actually deal with problems in the real world. And I was just in Stockholm a few days ago helping them commemorate the Holocaust Memorial Day. And I always think of this, at this time of year, that about the liberation of the camps, that when the camps, so we like to say liberation of camps, it's very, like, we like to say liberation, it makes us feel good. They were liberated, everything's okay after that. But from the point of view of the and everybody likes that language, not just politicians, even survivors like that language, or they use it sometimes. But when you read the diaries of the doctors and the nurses and so on who arrived at those places, in May or June of 1945, they said things like, well, we can't consider this liberation, or liberation is not the word. And the reason for that is that even though the greatest of evils is taken away, you still have the human beings who are there, and they're not free because they're starving, or they're sick, or they're traumatized, right? And when you read, and then when you read like the testimonies of Holocaust survivors, even decades later, that trauma is still there. So at what point exactly did they become free? Like that, so that word liberation, it does a lot of work, and I think a lot of the work is negative, because it teaches us, we draw from these most significant moments in political history the lesson that freedom is negative. It was just about pushing those SS guards out of the camps. And from that point forward, then we had freedom. And that's not true, right? That's simply not true. It was necessary, but it wasn't sufficient. In order for West Germany to become a free country, or a country of free people, there are no free countries. There had to be many other things besides the ending of concentration camps. There had to be the rebuilding of schools and the rebuilding of roads and many, many other things before Germans could be free. And so, or people in this country to be free. I say that because it's the same lesson in Ukraine today. Not quite as dramatically, but pretty dramatically. If you visit deoccupied places, and that, by the way, that's a Ukrainian word. It doesn't exist in English. Deoccupied creates some semantic space, because if a town has been deoccupied, nicht mehr besetzt, right? If it's deoccupied, that's not the same thing as saying that it's been freed. And so when you visit deoccupied territories, you see, feel, and hear that, of course, it's good that the torture chambers no longer function and that people are no longer executed, right? And that bombs no longer fall from the sky. But I think it's Ukrainian common sense that these people aren't really free until the rubble is cleared and the roads are cleared and the buses are running and the trains are running, right? That freedom isn't just about the horrible thing being removed, but it also has to be about the presence of some kind of normality, which leads you back into the future. So those were all arguments that were in the book, but Ukrainians certainly helped me to frame those arguments, and that's why Ukrainians appear so much in the book.
Tim, now I will give you the possibility to have some tea. Okay. I will try to ask my question,
ask a nice question.
A very long one. I will try. Yes, I very like this idea from your book that freedom is so much connected with labor, yeah, and with work, and it's a process, and it gives you a very special feeling of time and for being in time and having some relationship with it. And without this feeling, it's hard to imagine how the freedom, or in Ukrainian case also peace, is possible. Now I want to ask you something, what was, something about Trump, but also about Ukraine. What was my lesson from Maidan and then from the invasion? And during or right after the Russian invasion, I realized that I didn't properly learn this lesson from the Maidan. And the lesson was, you should be prepared for big changes, for big political challenges. There is, it can happen, it just happened. Yeah, like Maidan in Ukraine. I think we had many different grassroots activists or like groups, initiatives of different ideologies, but no one was really prepared, like you are quickly preparing yourself, being already in this moment. And now I'm thinking a lot about this necessity to be prepared, even living now in Germany, yeah, far away. It feels like far away from war and from Ukraine. And yesterday, as we were shortly speaking, you told that now, in this case, Trump 2.0, Americans are better prepared. Can you elaborate on this? And how to be, and probably in general, how to be prepared to live in today's times? Probably not all, it's relevant not only for Americans, also for Germans, I guess.
Yeah, I have a feeling that you're going to ask about Germany directly, or should I talk about Germany now?
We can start with Germany, yeah.
Okay, okay. So I think your lesson from Maidan is really important, that you really can't allow yourself to be shocked. Like it's a word that I'm really wary of when people say it in America, that like, this is shocking. And yeah, it's shocking. Like a lot of shocking things happen today in the United States. But when people say they're shocked, I think what they often mean is, I'm going to take a month to think about this now. And we just don't, we don't have that month, and it is, of course, their tactic. And when I say they, I mean, Yanukovych or Putin or Musk or Trump. It is their tactic to throw things at you that are so weird and so unexpected that you feel overwhelmed and you feel depressed and you feel dismayed. And that's that feeling, which is completely natural and human, of being shocked or dismayed, is part of the politics that's not your politics. It's somebody else's politics. Not that, I'm not saying we can't have human emotions. I'm just saying that when we have those human emotions, we need to share them with other people, and with other people who are doing things, whatever it is. And this is part of my answer to how you respond to the situation in general, is just make sure you're doing something. And it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be big. It probably isn't going to be big. It's probably going to be small. But it has to be something, because if you don't do anything, then the depression spiral just continues, and you feel helpless because you're not doing something. But if you do just a little thing, and the trick is, if you don't know what to do, find somebody who you admire and see what they're doing and then do it with them, whatever that is. And just remember, it doesn't have to be big, because you're not stopping it by yourself. You're taking part in creating something. You're taking part in creating a landscape which is harder for them to move through. And another thing that about Maidan, and this might be a little more controversial, and we might go back and forth on this a little bit, because it is actually difficult. But another thing about Maidan is coalitions. That there can come moments when you end up protesting with people who you would not have had over for dinner. And that if you only protest with people with whom you would have over for dinner, or the people you see at the Taz Cantina, right? If you only protest with people that you would hang out with, your protest is going to lose. And so there are moments when people come together over one thing, and then later they split apart again. But that doesn't mean that the protest wasn't important. And one sees this over and over again, at least in parts of history that we know something about. The Solidarity movement in Poland was very much like this. Maidan was like this. So just keep that in mind. I'm not saying when and exactly with whom you will have to, et cetera. I'm just saying that when I've been in big protests, often they were with people that I didn't agree with on everything. And as I look at who Trump is alienating within his own camp, I'm trying to think okay, Tim, I'm trying to think, could you do something, with this person or that person? Can you imagine doing that? Because it's some of the people who are going to be important are often those who break off from the other side, you know? So it's tricky and it's political and like they're human questions here, but the coalition part, there's a broad, I mean, electorally, this is true too. Like if you look at the Polish coalition that won, I think basically saving the Polish Republic, that coalition stretched from pretty far center right, you know, to almost the extreme left. And they still barely won, but they won. But without without that weird looking coalition, they wouldn't have done it. So on like what we're reacting against and Trump 2.0. So yeah, the Americans are certainly like, so like my view of what's going to happen in America is that there are going to be a lot of unexpected forms of resistance starting pretty soon, and that it's not going to look like 2017. It's going to look like something else. It's going to look like governors rebelling. It's going to look like local law enforcement refusing to go along with judgments coming from the center. I think there will be mass protests, but not just in DC. It's going to look like lawsuits. It's going to look like things I can't anticipate, I hope, because the next 6 months are going to be really rough. The difference is, and this is what I was trying to tell Katya earlier, the difference is that there are a lot of Americans who are aware that we can lose, let's call it constitutional rule. A lot of Americans are now aware of that. Whereas in 2017, when I published On Tyranny, very few were thinking in those categories. Now I think it's fair to say that a few million people are thinking in those categories. That doesn't mean that we're ready enough, but at least it does mean there are some people who are thinking the right way, in my view, and using the right concepts. But what is the thing? And here's where I want to get to Germany. Like, if you're in the United States now, not that I am, but if you're, as far as I can make out, like if you're in the US, the particular thing that you're up against is people who use far right-wing rhetoric and who themselves probably believe in that rhetoric, but nevertheless use far right-wing rhetoric to disassemble the government itself, thereby creating room for oligarchical rule. That's the actual thing which is happening right now in the US. And it's a combination of Musk and Trump, where Trump is basically the public relations part of the operation, and Musk is the actual unworking of the American federal government. That, in my judgment, I mean, people will watch this in 5 days, and I'll be terribly out of date. But in my judgment, that's what's happening. I think the far right part of it is both sincere, but also a tool. And it's a tool in the sense that it was used to get Trump over the line to a narrow but nevertheless real electoral victory. And that is, of course, relevant for Germany, because in Germany you also have people who are sincerely on the far right and who are also in a very public love affair with Elon Musk. And so the thing you have to ask yourself, if you want to be on the far right, okay, I realize who I'm talking to, but let me just make this point. If you want to be on the far right, that option may not be available to you in the sense that you think it is. So for example, on migration politics, the more Muskified the AfD becomes, the less you will actually have a migration policy. Because the oligarchs want to have illegal immigration. They like to talk about how bad it is, but what they mean is that it's bad in some, it's bad in some other place, but they need it, right? Musk loves illegal immigration. If we didn't have illegal immigration, Musk's companies would fail. He needs illegal immigration, and that's general. So what we have in the U.S. is now spectacular deportation, and it's meant to be a spectacle. Right? People are meant to be visibly humiliated. We're all supposed to be afraid. We're supposed to ask what next. We're supposed to be afraid of the concentration camps that they're building. But whether they actually deport more people than Biden, I think is up in the air. So far not. The president who deported the most in recent history is, of course, Obama. Whether they get that high, maybe they will, but I kind of doubt it. what I think they're going to do is have like deportation as spectacle and deportation as pretext to build concentration camps. And so this point isn't necessarily directly for you, but it's about the nature of like the German far right, because I think now there are probably still people in the AfD who think that they're going to be able to have policy if they win in cooperation with Musk. They probably don't realize to what extent their party is already in bed with Musk. Certainly the voters of the AfD, I expect, like the voters for the Republican Party in November 2024, don't understand that if they vote for a party that is owned by an oligarch, it's not a national party at all, right? Like, and this is the, and this is the tension. The people who pretend to be the most nationalistic, but who are in fact in bed with a transnational, self-interested South African, centibillionaire, they're not actually going to be able to make national policy. Or to put it a different way, if Republicans in the United States, having won an election, are not able to make policy, why would you be in the AfD and think you're going to get to make policy, even if you win the election? If Musk is in your party, you don't have any weapons. I mean, compared to the Republican Party in the US, come on. I mean, the AfD against Musk, that's not a contest, right? And they've already basically said we're part of Musk's oligarchical front. And I'm just saying this because I don't think this reality, I mean, this is probably the wrong audience I should be in, like, whatever. There's got to be some right-wing, there's got to be some right-wing equivalent to this. But this seems to me this is a reality which is only now sinking into Americans as it's happening. But you're following exactly the same track, where you have a far right-wing party with charismatic leaders, and people think it can have a migration policy. But meanwhile, Musk is appearing at the party conferences and like telling you not to worry about the Nazi past. You're in a parallel history to the American one. And the notion that a German government led by the AfD is going to be more sovereign than an American government, no. It's going to be less sovereign. And again, to stress, the thing that's happening in the US right now is the undermining from within of American sovereignty. That's what's happening. It's the removal of the functionality of the American state from within. That's what's going on. And I'm now going to bend a tiny bit away from, my invisible AfD voting public. I'm just going to submit that in general, most Germans, regardless of what party they vote for, believe that the state should be functional. I'm actually waiting for an audience reaction on this one. I think they generally believe the train should run, the plane shouldn't crash.
Yeah, this is the problem.
This is a real human example, by the way. I mean, the planes are crashing, and in 6 months, Musk's people are going to be going in front of cameras saying, the planes have always crashed. That's the way it always is. The planes have always crashed. It was worse under Biden. No, that's what they're going to, because they're going to keep crashing, and the trains are going to crash. Like, if you take apart, I mean, our government is, I know you have complaints about your central government and the trains don't run on time, and it's very sad, right? But the way your trains don't run on time is not the same way that our trains don't run on time. But we still have trains, right? And we still do have federal government functions. And if you take those federal government functions away, people start to suffer and die very quickly. Like, it's already started. We have the largest tuberculosis outbreak in the history of record keeping going on right now in Kansas, but you will not read about it because the Centers for Disease Control have been banned from publishing information about American health. So you can confirm what I just said, but you're going to have to do a little bit of digging because the federal centers who would normally talk about this, right? And it goes on and on. Like, they're not going to be allowed to talk about climate change. They're not going to be able to release climate data. And so, so I'm now kind of making a general appeal to what I take to be things Germans care about, almost no matter who they vote for. I mean, left-wing anarchists maybe are like annoyed by my appeal to, the state, sorry. But in general, I think Germans want there to be roads and railways, and they want the roofs of their houses not to fall in, and, they don't want epidemics, and, They don't want bird flu. And that is what, like, in effect, that's what this, like, right-wing oligarchic anarchism brings you. It brings you the destruction of the state from within. And so in this, I'm just stressing this because I think when people think right-wing government AfD, they're thinking, I don't know what they're thinking, you tell me, but I'm not sure that they're thinking oligarchical takeover, the government stops functioning, and cars start running into each other on Unter den Linden, which is what it's in fact going to be. I mean, it will be all the right-wing stuff too, but it will also be dysfunctionality, because the reason why Musk cares about AfD, this is something Germans have been asking me, and it's an easy question. Why does Musk care about AfD? I mean, partly he has sincere views about Germany in the 1930s, which he'd really like to share. And AfD gives him a platform to share. Yeah, and AfD gives him a platform, and you know it's nice when people with similar views can get together. But the reason why AfD is interesting to him is that he wants to break the German state, and he wants to break the European Union, and parties like AfD are, in his mind, the way to break the German state. So now I'm going to give you a left wing. I'm going to go a left wing on you now. If you think about European colonialism in Africa. Think about what you've learned in the last 15 years or so, since history took the spatial turn and the debates about the Holocaust switched over to Africa, and what you've learned about German colonialism in Africa. Just nod, because I just want to believe that you guys still read. So just nod like you do. No head shaking. I don't want to see any head shaking. So think about the way Germans or Belgians or the French or the British ruled in Africa. They ruled with a small number of people, but with wealth and technique. And one of the techniques was, in each country, they would pick out a clan or a group that they would use and ennoble and use to destroy the other political or social institutions. That's how not just in Africa, but in Africa most recently, that's how Europeans ruled. So when Musk looks at Germany, he sees a country to be colonized by way of that technique. He doesn't think that you're a real people with a real government that should survive. He's thinking, okay, how do I wipe out the political institutions in this space? I'm going to pick a clan that for whatever reason is most sympathetic to me and is most likely to collaborate in my general desire to wipe out the political institutions in this space. So that's how he sees AfD. That's the answer to why he's interested in AfD. It is the clan in Germany with whom he can collaborate in order to wipe out the other political institutions in this space.
Yeah, I have probably the last question before we open the discussion about Europe. You were speaking now on AfD a lot. Another a big problem, which is also discussed now, I think, in Germany, is the toxicity of AfD in the sense of this rhetorics and this kind of, I don't know, political approach is poisoning other political parties and setting kind of a trend, how the problems are addressed and how they have to be solved. And I think Europe as a post-war and I would say anti-imperial project or European Union is now in a interesting situation between Putin and Trump, between two different types of neo-imperialism, or how you call it in a book, of pseudo-populism. Probably it's also an interesting term to talk a bit about. And what should Europe do? I don't know. If some points, not, Yeah.
I mean, just to start with AfD, there's an understandable desire for states to be sovereign and for, there's an understandable desire for people to have some control over the space around them. I understand all of that. I think the thing where conservatives and people on the right sometimes go wrong about the European Union is that the European Union is a magnifier of European sovereignty, not the other way around. So even if you care about things like borders are your main issue, the European Union is the institution which has essentially created, continent-wide institutions of border control. Not that that's necessarily, I'm not judging whether that's a good thing or bad thing. I'm talking about this tricky situation where we're in, where parties on the right inside Europe say we have to be sovereign vis-a-vis the European Union. But if you weaken the European Union, you end up, in fact, being less sovereign, because the thing, in that wider world out there, the institutions and the individuals who want to take away your sovereignty are real. And the European Union is a fake enemy, right? So the European Union, if it's targeted as a way to increase sovereignty and it's weakened reputationally, then European countries actually become less sovereign. And you can see this on the example of the United Kingdom. I mean, if you, Brexit is now polling at 18%. And there's a reason for that, which is that the British realized that their lives are much more out of their control than they were before. And that's true. Their lives are much more out of their control vis-a-vis the Americans, vis-a-vis the Russians, vis-a-vis the Chinese. Their lives are more out of their control. You never have perfect control, but you can have more and you can have less. And if you leave the European Union or weaken the European Union or break it, you end up having less. And I just wanted to mention that because there are forces inside the American government, certainly Russia, China, which actually do want to see European countries not sovereign. Elon Musk wants to see your countries not sovereign. There are forces, and the guy has $500 billion. There are forces that actually do want to take Germany's sovereignty away. It's just that the EU is not one of them. The EU actually allows European countries to be sovereign by allowing them to pool their sovereignty and cooperate and make policies. Now I'm getting to the question of what you should do. And make policies that can actually protect you from those powers out there that want to do away with your sovereignty. So with Musk, is Musk going to somehow be caught by the law of Missouri? I'd like to think so. I'd like to think he's violated the law in Rhode Island, and as he's driving through Rhode Island one day, he's going to be pulled over by the highway patrol, and some nice policeman will say, "Mr. Musk, as a matter of fact, you failed to file a tax return." I'd like to think that, but I think perhaps at this point in the United States, those things are no longer realistic. But in Europe, they still are. But only so long as the European Union holds together, right? The European Union can regulate at the level of Twitter. It can regulate at the level of oligarchs. It still can. Germany, maybe. Maybe Germany can. Maybe France can. But the European Union certainly can. And so the sovereignty of the European states has to be protected from oligarchical, hostile powers by way of union-wide regulation, as well as national legislation. That's one thing. And then, I see in a very fundamental way, like Musk and Putin it depends on where you're sitting, of course, but Musk and Putin represent fundamentally similar threats. They are fundamentally, men who have midlife crisis, $500 billion, nobody around to tell them they're wrong. The list goes on. And they both made their money on things you shouldn't be able to make money on. And they both have fantasies. It is actually kind of striking, but they both have fantasies about the future, which are childish. So, Ukraine doesn't exist, and I'll see you on Mars are they're the same level of crazy thinking, right? And but in both cases, notice how many people are very respectful. Because if somebody has $500 billion, you're like, oh yes, maybe we will end up on Mars. Or, oh, of course, Mr. Putin, you could be right about those Russian speakers. right? Like if there's an awful lot of money behind an information apparatus, as there is in both cases, then you find people going along, maybe not the whole way, but like somehow these ideas, Ukraine doesn't exist. You might have noticed people saying things like that. They still do. Ukraine doesn't exist, and we're going to mine the minerals of Mars, or the same level of oligarchical unreality. But because there's so much money and specific information platforms behind that unreality, it works its way into our daily conversation. And people end up making, their vacation plans on this basis. I can't go on vacation in Ukraine because it doesn't exist, but I'm going to buy a ticket to Mars. Let the record record delayed laughter from the German audience. Better than nothing, my friends. Thank you. And so with Putin, so Musk and Putin are both oligarchical superpowers who want to destroy European statehood. And here you might notice I'm in a much more, conservative wavelength when I'm talking about statehood, but that is their target. They need to destroy European statehood because statehood is a thing which holds them back from the fantastical lives they're going to live forever. And so in that way, they're fundamentally similar. The instruments are a bit different with Musk, but actually there's a fair amount of overlap. And like, here's a project, go home tonight and make a list of the European political parties that Musk supports and the European political parties that Putin supports, and see like how many differences you find, right? In both cases, it's political parties that both of them think will destroy the statehood of the states in question. And they're right, especially when backed by them. And so with Putin, it's fundamentally the same. I mean, it makes Europe has to help Ukraine win this war. It's a relatively simple task which hasn't been taken up. But when you have a fascist centibillionaire who's trying to destroy a neighboring democracy, and you're only spending whatever it is, Germans correct me now, but whatever it is, 0.18% of your GDP on this problem, something's gone wrong.
I have a very last question, something like, let's talk about weather in the end of, make a weather forecast or analysis of this global weather. And I want to ask you, are we now in a perfect storm? And here's something optimistic.
The Perfect Storm was a Hollywood movie, right?
Yes.
Did anybody see it?
Me.
How did it end?
Hollywood.
Okay, so but like
Happy.
like lone heroes, but like individual heroes, or it ended badly. Okay, thank you. I just needed to know whether I could use it as because I can't. Good. I mean, the idea of a perfect storm, as everybody will know, is that a number of factors come together improbably in the same time and place to make things much worse than you could expect that they would. I mean, I guess the difference, one thing would be this, where we are now is quite, I'm sorry, but like quite predictable. Whereas a perfect storm, I think by its nature, is unpredictable. Where we are now is just devastatingly predictable. It's just incredibly predictable. I mean, this is just what happens if you let too few people have too much control over information and too much money. This is what you get. You get these warped conversations and threats to statehood. And you also, because of the wealth inequality and the information platforms, but also, at least in my country, but in Europe and Germany to some extent too, the objective block on social mobility associated with wealth inequality. Because of that, you get pushed into this world of fear and fantasy. So, I mean, it's a very frustrating. I find it a little bit frustrating because on the one side, all of this is totally predictable. It's really just, even down to the details, it was all predictable. And the reason why it's predictable is because of the underlying factors. But because it's underlying factors like social media platforms and wealth inequality and the ability to offshore money and the death of the local press, because it's structural factors, in principle, you can address all these things with policy. Like, they're not beyond our control. We can actually do things about them. So it's not a perfect storm in which we're on a boat helpless in the water. Like, there are definitely things that we can do. And one of the ways you do things, and I appreciate this conversation, Katja, very much. One of the ways you do things is by looking at other countries. Because, like I talked earlier about how we shouldn't feel like we're all alone, because then we become depressed and inactive. But one way that we need to also look is like side to side to other countries. So if you're an American right now, you should think about Hungary, because a lot of the techniques that were applied in Hungary are now being applied in the United States. It also helps to look at Russia a little bit earlier. But in general, when we get into these problems, we tend to think, this is my storm, like it's my national storm. And even those of us who think that we're on, even those of us who regard ourselves as being on the left, I think, do this as well. We think, okay, like this specific thing is happening in Germany. It's specific to AfD. It's specific to our Sonderweg. It's specific to us somehow. But often there are lessons like right next door. And people you can invite from other countries who have literally like been through the thing you're just about to go through. And that can be very helpful, because then you recognize, okay, it's not whether it's climate or something, and like climate is hard to change, but you can in fact change it. But you can only change it if you listen to people around you and think of some of these problems as being global. So, I guess I don't think it's a perfect storm, because I don't think it was unpredictable, and I don't think we're helpless. I think we're in a situation where we can recognize what's happening. We can see that weather coming, and we can still do things about it.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. And let's open up the conversation. We have a mic and we have hands.
Oh.
Test. Sorry, I also have a cold. So I think on behalf of everybody, I just want to say thank you so much, Timothy Snyder, for coming to Berlin. I think it's really great, particularly before the election happens, that you show up and talk about all these super important things. And my question is not only in regards to what you have to say about it, but also in regards to what Katarina actually said, which is that we feel like we are a long way away or far away from war. And I think at least 40% to 60% of the people in this room know clearly that you can go on to Flixbus and buy a ticket to Lviv for 69 euros. I don't know if those are the current prices. Perhaps somebody could check. It's not that far away. It's less than 980 kilometers. And having been to Ukraine multiple times for different reasons, charity-wise, throughout the full-scale invasion, I feel like it's right next door. And I struggle, as somebody who studies contemporary history of Eastern Europe at a German university, to tell not just my fellow students, but my friends, how close this thing actually is. And how do you talk to Germans about that? Because we've talked about the AfD, we've talked about Musk, but we haven't talked about Sarah Wagenknecht and how dangerous and imperial and Muscovite her opinions are. I don't know if that was worth a clap, but thanks. But in any case, the point being is, how do you sort of deal with this as maybe a North American in Europe, being a Ukraine expert and how do you tell people that Europe is actually smaller than they perceive it?
Well, first of all, thanks for what you're doing in going to Ukraine. Thanks for the question. I mean, it's a tricky one, right? Because I work on German history and I work on Ukrainian history, and I have ideas, and I'll share them, don't worry. But it's there's also this business that people have to they have to come to things in their own way from their own positions, and you also want to be respectful of where people are coming from. And a lot of so with Germans, there's, you've given an example. Sometimes there's open bad faith, and in the case of Ukraine, there's also just simple financial corruption involved. But often Germans are coming to things from the right place, but kind of made a wrong turn at somewhere, and we all do that, and I want to be respectful of that. I think one thing that maybe is a little too easy that people with bad faith appeal to is the idea of Frieden, right? Like this word Frieden, which has a kind of, it's almost like you're speaking Elvish, when you say Frieden in Germany, like, everyone suddenly gets very still and like we all feel good, and it's all false. Like it's all fundamentally false. Like the thing that happened, like the starting point of West Germany as a country of free people is not Frieden. It's defeat in a coalition war against a fascist enemy. It's defeat, like it's Niederlage. There was Sieg and there was Niederlage. And like not talking about Sieg and not talking about Niederlage and just choosing Frieden is only apparently anti-fascist. In my view, it allows Germans to mentally dodge the essence of what had to happen. For them to be in the kind of country they are now, they had to be defeated. And it wasn't easy, right? It wasn't an easy thing to get Americans into that war, let alone to sail across the Pacific, sail across the Atlantic, like win 2 different wars. That wasn't an easy thing for Americans to do, and it was a much harder thing and for the peoples of the Soviet Union to do. Dying in horrible numbers. All the peoples of the Soviet Union. This is not a national thing. Just Ukrainians in higher numbers than others because of the way the war took place. Belarusians in still higher numbers. Jews proportionately because of the Holocaust in the highest numbers of all. But it was a terribly hard thing to defeat Germany. It was a hard thing. It wasn't Frieden. Like the idea that like you could have just said peace in 1942 and everything would have been okay. It's just like it's painful to me that's the analogy that people could draw. Like that the notion is that when a fascist war is already going on, that you can just say peace. Like that's not anti-fascist at all, right? Like that's pro-fascist. If the Poles in 1939, instead of resisting, had just said peace, then the British would never have gotten into the war. The Americans never would have gotten into the war. Germany would have won. So you can't just say peace. You can't. That's not. It's not just wrong. Like it's delusive and it escalates the war, which is what it has done. And so this that magic formula in Germany, which is generally used, I'm afraid, by public figures in deliberate bad faith in German public life, is really dangerous because it suggests that when you have a major country like Russia, which is prosecuting an illegal war of atrocity and aggression, that somehow all you have to do is nothing. Just like be neutral, both sides are equal, maybe the side that started the war has something going for it. And you're escalating the war and you're killing people when you take that position. And that's what's happened. Germany has escalated the war. And Germany has escalated the war and Germany has killed people. Germany has killed a lot of people, a lot of Ukrainians. And if you want to say, oh, what about the Russians? Killed a lot of Russians too, because if the war had ended sooner, which it would have had Western economic might been mobilized the way it was in the Second World War, then those Russians also wouldn't have died. There are more than 1 million dead and maimed Russians. If the Germans who say they care about Russians really cared about Russians, they would have armed the Ukrainians and ended the war, but they didn't do that. They prevented that from happening. Second thing I want to say is precisely that, the economy. So the way the Americans defeated the Germans in the Second World War, and I don't by any means now want to minimize like the sheer human cost of like sending those American men across the Atlantic and, you know, having them die in France and having them, you know, that we lost a large number of people fighting in battles in Europe, and that's not something I want to like minimize at all. But fundamentally, the reason that America defeated Germany was that we mobilized a larger industrial economy. And we did so with purpose and quickly. When the war started, the American armed forces were roughly the size of the Bulgarian armed forces, and we did not have a war economy, but we created one very quickly. And that is exactly what Europe, with Germany in the lead, has failed to do. Like, you didn't have to send soldiers across the Atlantic. You don't have to put soldiers on that bus to Lviv. Nobody's even asking you to do that. Sorry, that's like a German you, but you know, nobody's asking you to do that. But you did have the most impressive industrial economy in the West, and that was not mobilized, right? Like, Rheinmetall has asked to do things which they've not been allowed to do. But broadly speaking, that economy has not been mobilized. It has not been mobilized for the ammunition, for the artillery shells, for like the basic stuff. 3 years have gone by. The Americans have made the same mistake, by the way. But in general, like the reason why the big economies won the Second World War, it is, you know, underlying, right? The underlying reason is they were bigger economies, but they mobilized those economies. 3 years into this war, right? So this is like you know, by Second World War analogies, this is 1942. 3 years in, the bigger economies, Germany, America, okay, the sides are different this time, but the big economies have not mobilized for war. And that, you know, that is a fundamental mistake. And it's like each week, each month, somehow wasn't the right time, but it was the right time in February 2022, and it's also the right time in February 2025. Like every moment that you let go by without doing this kills Ukrainians and kills Russians, and it extends and escalates the war. The third thing, which I've been trying to talk about as a historian, well before this war, I mean, well before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the first one in 2014, and this is something that, you know, I came to understand on my own long before any of this happened, and it's one of the main arguments in my book, Bloodlands, which was published in 2010, which I finished in 2009, is the centrality of Ukraine to the Second World War. So let's assume that there are Germans who, in good faith, you know, do want to apply not just the economic lessons and the political lessons, but the moral lessons of the Second World War. One of the moral lessons of the Second World War is that you shouldn't fight a war of colonization over Ukraine, which is what the Germans did. And I'm shocked to see in public opinion polls that just a microscopic percentage of Germans still realize that's true. Like if you ask Germans why the Second World War was fought or what Hitler's war aims were, Germans still don't know. Like 3 years into a major, essentially global conflict over Ukraine, Germans still don't know that in Hitler's second book and in Mein Kampf, he makes it very clear that what he's after is the Kornkammer, and that the Ukrainian breadbasket is going to transform Germany into a world power. That's what it was all about. And that means, for one thing, it should be not hard. It should be easy, not hard, for Germans to see Russia's war in Ukraine as colonial, because they did the same thing, essentially. And the second thing is that if there is a German moral sensibility about the Second World War, which I like, you know, it's one of these things I like to believe, it has to include Ukraine. I mean, I'm not saying Ukraine has to be number one. The Holocaust can be number one, but even the Holocaust doesn't make sense without Ukraine. This is the other thing I struggle with a little bit in the commemorations, that like, in order for I realize commemoration has to be simple and like it has to be first person. But when we remember the causes of it, like the reason the Germans could kill so many Jews was because they were invading Ukraine. That is a necessary cause. The reason why Germans were in Poland and in the Western Soviet Union, which is where almost all the Holocaust took place and where almost all the victims lived, was because of the imperial or colonial war aimed to control Ukraine. And I just miss this, and I miss this so much in the German discussion. Like it's there now, like it was completely absent 10 years ago, and it is there a little bit now. But I miss that sense of responsibility. You know, you would think that people could say, we invaded Germany, we invaded Ukraine once, And so the least we can do is maybe help them when they're invaded the second time, you know? But that, like, that basic loop, that basic connection hasn't been made. So you asked me, like, how I would talk about it. This is how I do talk about it. Like, this is my best shot. That's what I do say to people.
I would like your perspective on the economy. If we think here, if you think about, you know, why Trump won in the U.S., there's a lot of debate that it was because the general public or the people didn't feel they were doing well economically. We all hope we could top Russia by having, you know, sanctions and making sure that the general public in Russia was turning against the war. That hasn't turned out. So the economy and how people in their everyday lives feel has a huge role, and I would just love your thoughts on that going forward or what we're facing right now.
I'm going to try to be brief because I'm not sure I have anything so like original to say about that. One thing, so on the I mean, I feel like I can't comment like on how the German election is going to turn out. I haven't been following it that closely. I haven't been following the German economy that closely. So let me just stick with the American analogy that you made. I think the Democrats lost for a lot of reasons, and most of them were beyond their control. I think there's a huge anti-incumbency problem, and I think Trump was in this lucky position that he ran as a challenger and the incumbent at the same time, and kind of got the benefits of being both. Like for his people, he was the incumbent; he never left office, but for a lot of people, he was also the challenger to the status quo. And as you say, they were unhappy with the status quo. And in the way the American system works, if it's a binary, so if you're not happy with the status quo, you vote for the other guy. And Americans don't have super long memories, so it was already kind of controversial for us, you know, whether COVID happened under Trump or whether it happened under Biden. And so he, like, I think in a way he got lucky. And I think Harris, I'm going to say a couple of things that like are kind of unpopular, but I think Biden had in general, with the exception of Gaza, but in general, I think he had a really good and very consequential. He should have done more on Ukraine, you know, but he had on domestic policy anyway. He was a very consequential president. I think he'll be remembered as such. And I think Harris actually ran a pretty good campaign, but one area where they were a little weak was on what you say, and the mistake they made, which you don't want to make, is by confronting like human experience with numbers or confusing like cost of living with inflation. They could have been better about that, and they could have honestly been they could have been more populist about it. I don't think populism is like, I think people say populism as though I don't see what's so bad about populism. Like, populism is like, I'm going to give you $5,000 when you have a baby. Like, that's cool with me. Have babies, I'll give you $5,000, I promise. That's populism. Like, or, you know, I'll give you $5,000 to buy an electric car. You know, that's populism, like making promises to people about how you're going to give them money. I don't really understand why people use populism to mean, you know, something like right-wing necessarily, because it's not. Like, historically, it's actually kind of left-wing. But putting that aside, like, I think they could have done more populist things, like, the Harris administration is going to give you $15,000 to have a baby, or whatever. They could have done more of that, or like, we're going to give you some kind of supplement to make gas prices go down. Like, as you say, like basic everyday household things, they could have done better. And you see that a little bit with center-left politicians kind of everywhere, that there's this little tiny bit of out-of-touchness with everyday life. But you've already, like, I'm not saying anything you didn't already say in your question, so I should probably stop talking.
Thank you for the conversation. I come from Poland, from Warsaw. I'm right here. And you finished your lecture, your conversation with the sentence, "We're not helpless. We can do still things about it." And my question is, what can we do? Because I'm, to be honest, quite skeptical and pessimistic about the future, considering the politics, 2, military, 3, far-right parties, not particularly maybe the populist parties, as you just said. And I'd like to mention here the book The Lights That Failed, that pretty much, from Krastov and from Holmes, that pretty much changed my perspective on my own country. And I kind of spotted that France, Germany, UK, US, the West as a whole doesn't really look at the Eastern Europe as a, well, how to put it, equal guys, let's maybe put it this way. And I've also read some other books on this one by TGA or lately by Carl Giles, the book Who Will Defend Europe. And it doesn't really leave any room for optimism. I mean, we're unarmed. We don't really know what's going to happen in the upcoming 6 months, maybe a year. We don't really know anything. Possibly Trump doesn't know himself what he's going to do. So that's my first question. What are your thoughts on what's going to happen from the military point of view?
I feel like this is a world where maybe there should only be one question.
Okay. Sorry. What's going to happen in the upcoming year from your perspective? Mm-hmm. What's going to happen with NATO? From that's already the second question, but I have to ask you regarding the question. Yeah. Whether you think it's going to survive, whether you think, considering, I don't know, Putin attacking Estonia, Latvia, Poland, Finland, okay, what's going to be the reaction?
Okay, so my main takeaway from this question, and you know, Yvonne and Steve, hi, I love you guys. My main takeaway from this is like that book was a bit of a downer. But I would note that book didn't, you know, it doesn't anticipate certain things which have actually happened since. Like the idea that the light failed, the light of democracy. It's a reference to the 1930s, and the idea is that the thesis, which I'm sure I'm not going to do justice to, is that a lot of the politics in the West has been a politics of mirror imaging, where the attempt to copy the West ends up creating these sort of false institutions, which are then copied in turn by the West, and then we're in kind of a downward spiral. You know, I think, I mean, for one thing, Poland itself slightly undermines the thesis of the book. I don't really think that you can see the result of the last parliamentary elections as an echo of the West in any sense. I think they are like a homegrown, you know, Donald Tusk knocking on doors for 2 years type of outcome. And I think, honestly, the fact that, you know, somebody who was the most important politician in the European Union would go back to his own country and literally go from village to village for 2 years and knock on doors and listen to people's problems and then become prime minister, I'm going to say that's a happy story. Like, I'm going to say that's a good thing. Like, there are many parts of that which seem improbable, but nevertheless it happened. And politics in Poland is at a much higher level of decency than it was recently. And with the U.S. even, you know, Trump didn't even get a majority. You know, like, I have to constantly correct Europeans who are trying to do quick TV interviews with me, and they say, well, you know, how could Trump have gotten a majority when? But he didn't actually get a majority. If we had a normal 2-round presidential election, I think Harris would have beat him by 5 points in the second round, because so much of his voting was protest, right? And you vote protest the first time, and then in the second round of the presidential election, like, you actually kind of come to your senses. At least I've noticed that happening in France and in other countries. If we had had a second round, I think she would have beat him by 5 points, but we only had one round, and in that one round he got 49.5 or so, and she got 48.5 or so, and then it was over. But bad things are happening in America, but the actual, you know, the outcome of the U.S. presidential election is maybe not as dark as one would have thought. And if we have elections in 2 years, the Democrats are going to, if we have, I mean, that's an important proviso, of course, but if we do, the Democrats are going to win by a bunch, because this stuff he's doing now is really unpopular. But my main objection would have to do with, like, optimism and pessimism and what do I think is going to happen. Because, I mean, I take a really Gramscian view about this. Like, what's going to happen depends on us, you know, like, optimism of the spirit. I mean, what's going to happen depends upon us. It was actually Romain Rolland who said that, for all of you, like, lovers of Swiss literature. He was the one who said optimism of the spirit, pessimism of the mind. But like, what's going to happen depends on us. to a really large extent, and whether we see all of this as being kind of impossible to resist or not. And this is where Maidan comes in, because like Maidan had no business succeeding. And likewise, the Ukrainian army had no business succeeding. If you talk to all of the, and I did, if you talk to all of the like the hard-headed realists in Washington, D.C., the Ukrainian army had no business resisting. But they did, and because they did, the world changed. And so in response to questions like this, I try to remember people, not just in Ukraine, but in Latin America and other places I care about, who are facing much harder odds and nevertheless have managed to do things. So I think a lot depends upon us. As for NATO, I think European leaders are going to have an interesting, this is now a kind of geopolitical, high political, Trump washing type situation, but European leaders are going to have the challenge of explaining to Trump that if he wants to be strong, he's going to have friends, because there is there are basic contradictions at the heart of Trumpism. One of them is you can't be strong, you can't alienate your friends and be strong. Like the reason why the United States is strong, and this is a shock to every American, but the reason why we're strong is that we have allies like Canada and Denmark who cooperate with us on almost everything. And we can't actually get more out of Canada and Denmark by invading them than we already have. We get a lot less, because it's like you invade countries, they become a little bit less willing to help you out. And you destroy a lot of the things that you thought you wanted in the first place. So the contradiction inside Trumpism is you can't be weak without friends. And the other contradiction inside Trumpism, by the way, which we already talked about, is you can't be strong while you destroy your own government. And these are things that, maybe he'll figure out. And I would just say that, European leaders have a role in talking to him about those things. I am not hopeful about where Trumpism is going to go domestically. I think in foreign policy it can go various ways, and that will have to do with some very simple things, like the guy wants to die in clean sheets in the White House with a Nobel Peace Prize on his chest, and that's something you can work with. You can work with. I can't work with it, but European leaders can work with it. Because he wants the Peace Prize for getting to peace in Ukraine. And in order to get to peace in Ukraine, he's going to have to do a certain number of things. But as for NATO, I think that's going to depend on NATO leaders dealing with Trump in the right way. I don't think we're going to invade Greenland. I don't think we're going to invade Canada. I don't think they have the attention span for that kind of thing. I think they're going to try to bully Europeans and Canadians. And I think Europeans and Canadians are aware that they have to respond to the bullying with some kind of posture of strength. And I think that's what's going to happen. And I think in domestic policy in 6 months, it's going to be, the US is going to look like Mad Max. But I think with less attractive actors in the leading roles, I just want to say, a lot less physical fitness. But I think, and again, in 6 months, people can read this and laugh at me, but I think in 6 months, probably the foreign affairs will look less crazy than it does today, because I think because he can do things let me put it this way. In the US, he can do things just by talking. He can scare people, he can issue executive orders. But with respect to Russia, he can't scare people with tweets, and he can't issue executive orders. And he will eventually figure this out. And from there comes the reality. No, because he's trying it. He's issuing threatening tweets to Putin, as though Putin were a South Dakota Republican who had voted the wrong way, And now he's expecting stochastic violence in Irkutsk or something. But you can't do that with Russia. He has to actually have a policy, and they'll eventually realize that. And then the Europeans come in and they say, okay, you know what, Mr. Trump, we got some ideas about policy. That is possible. And I think it's honestly more likely than that things go well in the U.S. And there are things that Europeans can do. There is Norway. If Norway gave its hydrocarbon profits to Ukraine at a rate of 5% a month of what they've achieved so far from the war, Ukraine would win. Germany mobilizes industrial potential along with a couple allies, Ukraine would win. If there's a ceasefire, okay, so the whole Ukraine-Russia thing is very unpredictable because the actors involved are very unpredictable and wars are very unpredictable. And right now we're kind of fixated on like the idea of a grand bargain. And the reason, I think part of the reason we're fixated on that, I don't know if Germans are, but Americans are, because it's like big strong man Putin and big strong man Trump, and they're going to come together and they're going to do a big strong man thing. Because that's a very appealing way to think about world politics. Like, okay, there was like the little men were fighting this confusing war, but now the big strong men are going to stride onto the scene with their big strong peace treaties, and they're going to have a big strong negotiation. I think just that's a very attractive way for the press to report it, and the German press does this too. Like, you know, what is Trump going to do, right? And the thing is, that question, like, was will Trump machen? Sorry, Trump. Was will Trump machen? Was will Putin machen? Those questions are very disempowering for Europeans. Like, those questions are, like, that's a way of not doing anything. When is the big strong man going to show up and do his big strong thing? Oh, he didn't. And then the headline the next day is, big strong man has yet to do big strong man thing. You know, and next day it's like, Germans eagerly await as big strong man prepares to do big strong man thing. And it's with Putin too. And so we're already in this moment. We're already in this moment where the European, the American press are like saying, oh, maybe Trump has a plan. You know? Today, Trump hasn't revealed the plan. Maybe tomorrow, and it's going to be a big, strong plan, right? That's where we are with the press coverage, and it's like this sort of, like this authoritarian fantasy, basically. And what I want to say is that the big, strong man peace plan is improbable. What's more likely is that they get to some kind of peace, some kind of ceasefire without any legal agreement, okay? And that is the moment where Europeans have to act fast. I'm going to tell you what's most likely. Trump and Putin get to some kind of ceasefire, and then the European media, appealing to the way Europeans have been trained to see the world, will start again. They'll say, big strong men got ceasefire. Maybe tomorrow, big strong men will get big strong treaty. And then there'll be more of that. And like once there's a ceasefire, it'll be like, when will Putin and Trump get the treaty? They're not going to get the treaty, probably. But the moment after the ceasefire, if there is a ceasefire, is when Europeans need to act really fast to secure Ukraine in their own interest, not just for moral reasons. And the ceasefire will be an opportunity to do that because there won't be rules. That's what the nature of a ceasefire. So there was once a country called West Germany. Some of you have something to do with it. It was created in the absence of a peace treaty. There was never a peace treaty after the Second World War. There's a really cool country called South Korea. You might have heard of it. They've got that music. There was no peace treaty. There is still no peace treaty. They're still at war, right? You don't need a peace treaty to become a successful democracy associated with the West. You don't need a peace treaty. What you need is a ceasefire and then a ton of investment. You need businesses to go in. You need governments to go in. You need to take advantage of the ceasefire. And that means, in particular, European Union membership very quickly, very, very quickly for Ukraine. So here, that's what Europeans can do. So when Europeans are like, oh, what can we do? That's the answer. If Trump and Putin get to a ceasefire, you go into Ukraine the way that West Germany was helped after the Second War, the way that South Korea was helped in the early 1950s. That is what you do, and you have all the power in the world to do it. You can absolutely do that. The Americans won't under Trump. You can absolutely do that. That is something that Europeans can do, and it will be history changing if you did it. All right, I feel like that was an up note. I feel.
Okay. We should stop. Sorry, I am in the role of health manager of team, and thank you for your responses. Like each response was, a beautiful article about European politics and about Ukraine and about what to do in the future. Now we have probably a couple of minutes for signing and. I will go back there and I'll sign it. Yeah, thank you so much for coming.